Welcome to Pimpy's Investment Chat, where we keep investment talk simple. And here's your host, Pimpy.
What is going on out there, peeps? Man, what a day it's been. Anyways, could our friend Sauter here, could he possibly, and this is going to sound crazy, could he possibly be purposely going out of his way to end the Shiites' control over Iraq? It appears that way, or does he have a more sinister reason behind what he's doing? Maybe it is that Sauter himself wants to be the next Saddam Hussein. Before we get into that, though, hit the thumbs up button. If you're not a subscriber, please do so, because when you do, it helps out the channel, and I certainly do appreciate it. If you're thinking about buying gold and silver, go to our friends over there at Money Metals Exchange. The link is down below in the description. If you're a first-time buyer and you spend more than $100, use promo code Pimpy, P-I-M-P-Y, and you will get a free half ounce of silver. See, here we go. The revenge of Sauter. Why Iran could be the real loser in Iraq's intra-Shiite struggle. So on August 29th, the Iraqi Shiite clerk Sauter announced that he would withdraw from politics after months of failed attempts to form a new government. Thousands of supporters of the nationalist leader, who has emerged as a staunch opponent of Iranian-backed militia in Iraq, surged into the streets in anger, clashing with Iraqi security forces, breaching concrete barriers around Baghdad's green zone, and storming the seat of government. After dozens of people were killed, Sauter went on television and instructed his supporters to go home, easing for the moment at least a political crisis that paralyzed Iraqi's caretaking government for months. See, here's the thing. Sauter is not a friend of the United States. And I've had people that actually are over there in Iraq saying, hey, out of curiosity, Pimpy, why Sauter? Why do you think Sauter is the right choice? And I say, you can take a look at what's going on around the world. And sometimes the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I don't like what Sauter done. I know he fought with our troops. I know that American soldiers died. But what I admire now is his attempt to turn the country over to the Iraqi people and let the Iraqi people decide on what should happen in Iraq. It's the same type of move that Trump made. People are like, oh, nationalism. They try to make it sound like such an evil, wicked word. It's not. Not at all. And over here in our country, they go, the white nationalists, the white supremacist nationalists. They do everything they can to smear what a nationalist is. And basically, a nationalist is a person who believes in helping their people first and foremost before running around and helping the rest of the world. Every country out there has issues. They do. But when your government, like ours, is sending trillions upon trillions of freaking dollars to places around the world and is not focusing on the high homeless rate, high drug addiction rate, high crime rate we have here in our own country, I have a problem with it. Focus here first, and then we can go out and help the rest of the world. And Sauter's no different. Although I'm hearing he might have a hidden agenda behind it, I'm curious to see what happens. It says Iraq's political system has been deadlocked since last October, when the country held its fifth parliamentary election since the U.S.-led invasion in 2003. Sauter's alliance won the most seats, but neither his bloc nor any other has managed to form a government. So I'm curious to see who it is that we do support over here in the United States. In the past, Bush supported Maliki. I told you, they're all part of a huge corrupt crime family. They really are. And so people like the United States looks for the corrupt people to run governments because they're criminals. It's easy to blackmail them. It's easy to persuade them to do what you want because you appeal to the criminal side of them. It says Sauter's alliance won the most seats, but neither his bloc nor any other has managed to form a government. The conflict has played out not between rival sects or ethnic groups, but within Iraq's largest community, the Shiites, who are divided over the country's leadership with Iran. the Sadrists, whose leader was once Tehran's closest ally, argued that Baghdad should distance itself from all foreign powers, including Iran. Other factions remain more closely aligned with Iraq's powerful neighbor. So you got to remember that Iran wants Iraq to become an Islamic state just like they are. Although Sadr claims to have retired from politics, he is likely working to leverage this latest cycle of brinkmanship and street protests to gain the upper hand over his rivals. Sadr has made similar pronouncements in the past but has never truly withdrawn from the political realm. He seeks to establish himself as Iraq's undisputed Shiite power broker and to dominate the sectarian power-sharing system that has been in place since shortly after the United States toppled Iraq's President Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime. Although Sadr has couched his power play as a crusade against corrupt political classes that is beholden to Iran and other foreign powers, his gambit poses another risk to the fragile Iraqi state. Baghdad could be overpowered by Iranian-backed political factions, but by a Shiite Islamic cleric who once commanded one of Iraq's most powerful militias. That may seem like a long shot in the wake of Sadr's failed street protest. I wouldn't call them failed street protests, but let's say strategic is more like it. But as an heir to one of Shiite world's most renowned clerical families, Sadr has proved remarkably adept to parlaying his religious pedigree into hard power. His opponents should think twice before counting him out. But as you're going to see, that Sadr is up against some seriously big hitters. These are religious leaders who are truly respected in their communities. It says Sadr embodies a rebellious and nationalist brand of Shiism in Iraq. Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani, the country's most revered cleric, and other senior Shiite theologians eschew direct political involvement. In doing so, they have created a power vacuum within the Shiite community, one that Sadr has worked for 2 decades to fill. A brash, little-known cleric who first emerged in 2003 in Najaf, Iraq's center of Shiite theology. Sadr went on to become one of Washington's most vexing enemies in Iraq. This is what I'm talking about. It is known that Sadr has killed American soldiers. His militia, the Mahdi Army, fought against U.S. forces for years, killing hundreds of American soldiers. From the beginning, he sought to combine political power with religious authority, despite having limited theological credentials and an apparent disdain for the years of study under senior clerical required to obtain the title of Ayatollah. In other words, he did not want to dedicate himself to the years of studying to do what it takes to become an Ayatollah. Without such qualifications, Sadr could not issue religious ruling or serve as a marja, an example for the Shiite faithful to emulate. But as the only surviving son of the Grand Ayatollah Sadr, a leader Shiite scholar who challenged the Ba'athist regime until his assassination in 1999, the political younger Sadr was able to follow his father's footsteps as the political leader of the Sadrist movement. Now, what they're talking about, the Ba'athist regime is a communist regime. It is one that Saddam Hussein belonged to. Since the U.S. invasion, Sadr has been the Iraqi leader most adept by navigating the intersections of politics and religious authority, a fact that could explain his latest maneuver. Man, this guy is unbelievable. Iraq's political crisis has lasted nearly 11 months. Yet Sadr did not initiate bloody street protests until he confronted a threat beyond politics, one to his religious legitimacy. A day before Sadr declared his retirement from politics, the Grand Ayatollah al-Hadi, an Asian Iraqi cleric based in Iran, who has served as a spiritual guide to many members of the Sadrist movements, announced that he was stepping down due to poor health, but instead of calling on his followers to transfer their allegiance to another Iraqi Shiite cleric, one who might be sympathetic to Sadr. Hadi advised them to follow Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei. It was an unusual move, since most Grand Ayatollahs instruct their followers to emulate other senior clerics only after the clerics have died, and the pronouncement of the Grand Ayatollahs are typically filled with religious invictions and platitudes, whereas Hadi was implicitly critical of Sadr. That's why we saw in the news how Sadr was pissed off, claiming that they have turned some of the senior alliances away from him. This is what he's talking about. Without naming him, Hadi said that Sadr risked tearing apart Iraq and its Shiite majority. He also suggests that Sadr lacked the necessary qualifications for religious leadership and challenged the younger cleric's status as the heir to his family's legacy. Ouch, man. That's, nothing's worse than you have these people that you idolize and you worship growing up, only to have them turn on you, man. It's got to be painful. In his own speech calling for an end to the recent demonstrations, Sadr claimed that Iranian officials and his Iranian-backed Shiite rivals were behind Hadi's criticism. This backstabbing reflects a growing power vacuum within the Iraqi Shiite community, one that has opened up and an Iranian influence in the country has waned. For years, Iran's supreme leader sent out General Soleimani, the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Foreign Operations Unit, to Iraq to keep Tehran's Shiite supporters in line. But after the United States killed Soleimani in a drone strike back in 2020, Iran lost an important lever of power over the Iraqi allies. Soleimani's successor has been less successful at keeping Iraqi Shiite factions, especially the Sadrists, from challenging Tehran. Although Sadr has betrayed himself as an Iraqi nationalist who seeks to stamp out foreign meddling, he lived in Qom, Iran's center for Shiite scholarships, during some periods of Iraqi civil war, and was once allied with Tehran. But Iran's leaders grew exacerbated with Sadr's unwillingness to work with the Iraqi ally, and they likely tried to increase their pressure on Sadr by convincing him that Hadi to question his religious legitimacy. More political machination are likely. Sistani, the most powerful cleric in Iraq, is in his 90s and believed to be in poor health. His statements are becoming rare. Shiite leaders in Iraq and Iran are preparing for his death and a potential rupture if more than one successor emerges from the jiff. Despite his limited credentials, Sadr is positioning himself for the post-Sistani period, hoping to play a role in choosing a successor or consolidating support in the case there are competing heirs. Sadr's drive for great political influence in Iraq is part of his campaign. With more sway over the government in Baghdad and greater share of its spoils, Sadr will be able to exert even more influence over Iraqi religious establishments. So will this portion of the article explain what's really going on with Sadr? Let's take a look. To the victor, the spoils. Iraq's current political crisis stems from Sadr's failure to form a government after winning the largest share of seats in the country's 329-seat parliament. Historically, Iraq's Shiite factions have coalesced after elections, often with the help from Iran, to form a large bloc and distribute top government ministries, eventually bringing in the Sunni and the Kurdish party. But with the support of just 73 lawmakers, Sadr tried to form a coalition government with the Sunni and the Kurdish factions and freeze out the Shiite opponents. Had he succeeded, his supporters would have claimed that the Sadr upended the highly unpopular ethno-sectarian power-sharing system known as the Mohassasa the United States and its Iraqi allies imposed after the invasion. But Sadr is actually trying to further consolidate that system under his control, not destroy it. Sadr is particularly loath to ally with Maliki, whose bloc won 33 seats in the last year's election, the second highest among Shiite factions after Sadr's. Maliki, who served as prime minister from 2006 to 2014, was responsible for many of the disastrous policies that alienated the Sunnis, weakened the Iraqi security forces, and allowed ISIS to capture nearly one-third of the country. But Sadr's rivalry with the former prime minister isn't just about Maliki's record. It is personal. In 2008, Maliki, with support from the United States officials, ordered Iraqi security forces to fight Sadr's militia in the southern Iraq. The clerk never forgave Maliki for damaging his movement at the height of the Iraqi civil war. The Muhassasa system of doling out the spoils was modeled on Lebanon's dysfunctional arrangement, which sought to guarantee the rights of religious minorities, but ended up creating endemic corruption, political instability, and economic collapse. Not everything that the United States puts their hands into is good. Our country is not that nice. Under Iraq's regime, the prime minister must be Shiite, the speaker of the parliament a Sunni, and the largely ceremonial president a Kurd. The system extends through most layers of government and the civil services. At each parliamentary election, sectarian parties divide up the ministries, causing long delays in cabinet formation as they jockey for the offices with the most lucrative government contracts and other sources of patronage. See, we do that here in the United States. The same damn thing, man. We got a corrupt government that does the same thing. As a result, the number of public workers in Iraq has tripled since 2004, just like here in the United States. And the government now pays 400% more in salaries than it did then. In 2020, nearly 3/4 of Iraqi's budget went to paying salaries and pensions for the bloated public sector. Welcome to our world here in the United States. Most Iraqi parties and factions that came to power after 2003 benefited from the system of sharing the spoils and are reluctant to abandon it, even as they drive their oil-rich country towards financial ruin and fail to provide electricity, clean water, healthcare, and other basic service to the Iraqi people. Do you see what they're saying? The corrupt are too busy helping themselves. They could care less about the people that they serve. Sadr's movement and its allies also gain from the current system. Despite the clerk's best efforts to portray himself as a reformer, his power stems from a combination of religious and populist appeal and the fruits of the state's patronage. Like other members of the Iraqi elite, Sadr has maneuvered his aides and supporters into senior government positions. Dramatic reform would not serve his interests, which is why he doesn't seek to abolish the power-sharing system, but rather to position himself atop of its kingmaker. Down but not out. In trying to solidify his control over the system after last year's elections, Sadr may have overplayed his hand. After months of negotiations with the Sunni and Kurdish parties, the Sadr has cobbled together a parliamentary majority that would have been able to elect a president, who in turn could have nominated a prime minister to form a cabinet. The parliament would have then had to approve the cabinet before the ministers took their post. But in February, Iraq's Supreme Court, whose judges are appointed by pro-Iranian Shiite factions. Do you see where the trouble is, you guys? Do you see this? So they're appointed by Iranian Shiite factions, ruled that the legislature must convene with at least 2/3 majority to elect a president, and opposed to the simple majority required in previous years. Shiite factions that opposed Sadr's boycotted the parliamentary session, deny him the supermajority needed to hold a vote. Sadr tried to peel away from some rival Shiite factions by offering them control of the various ministries, but he refused to negotiate with Maliki and failed to gain a supermajority. In June, Sadr's candidate for prime minister, Jafar al-Sadr, the clerk's cousin and the current Iraqi ambassador to the United Kingdom, withdrew his candidacy. Sadr then ordered his 73 lawmakers to resign from parliament in masse, hoping to force his rivals to lift their boycott and reconvene the chamber. But Sadr's gambit backfired as his Shiite opponents quickly moved to fill the seats, which by law go to the runner-ups in each district when the winner resigns. That's terrible, man. With his rivals commanding a new parliamentary majority, Sadr feared he could be excluded from the government that could stay in power for 3 years. In July, he responded by arguing his followers to breach the green zone and blockade parliament with a sit-in protest to prevent a vote of the new president and cabinet. Thousands of Sadrists packed a tent encampment demanding the dissolution of the current parliament and early elections. The Sadr siege of parliament ended on August 30th, after Sadr ordered his supporters to leave the streets to avoid more violence. In reacting to Hadi's religious challenge, Sadr may have miscalculated by instigating violent protests without a clear plan to break Iraq's political deadlock. But Sadr has a way of recovering from political setbacks and emerging with even greater power. Despite his reputation as a temptress and erratic leader, Sadr has played a long game, outlasting the U.S. occupation and some Asian members of the Najaf religious hierarchy. He built a formidable social and political movement that can deliver votes and take advantage of Iraq's corrupt patronage system. For years, Sadr showed greater political skills than the United States and his Iraqi rivals gave him credit for, and he consistently outmaneuvers them. So far, Sadr has fallen short of his campaign to contain Iran's influence, weaken other Shiite factions in Iraq, and exert control over his country's power-sharing arrangement. The question now is whether Sadr's opponents will try to exclude him from the government entirely and risk unleashing a new cycle of bloodshed, or attempt to reach a compromise and thereby delaying his grand ambition to become Iraq's most powerful Shiite leader. So yeah, again, Sadr is no angel. We know this. He's not a fan of the United States. The thing that I do support is his nationalism. The fact that he wants to go out there and just do the work for the Iraqi people. It'll be a government by the people and for the people is what he's looking for. But you guys let me know what you think. I'll look forward to your comments down below. And that is it for now. I'm out.